Hence, this medium through which information and misinformation gets channelized has both positive as well as negative impact upon shaping public opinion at large. It is believed that prudent usage of social media can be instrumental in altering people's behavior positively, while misleading content can only create further divide, fear, and stigma across places among people. In today's webinar, we have two very interesting topics pertaining to social media and its role in fostering information in our societies. The first keynote speaker will be dealing with the role of social media that is directly related to this ongoing pandemic. The second keynote speaker will be presenting his views on social media with respect to the process of democratization and reactionism forwarded by dominant groups. Before we move to these discussions, I would like to call upon our principal, Dr. Subhash Biswas, for his inaugural address and to felicitate this event with his words of wisdom.
Am I audible?
Sir, yes, sir. Yes, sir, you are audible.
Let me start. Oh.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, you can.
Thank you all participants. Special thanks. Okay. Thank you all. You have all gathered in a very spacious evening just after a day of Teachers' Day. So I on behalf of my college, that is Humayun Kabir College, welcome all of you participated in the webinar. Especially thank Mr. Sumit Chaturvedi, Mr. Tilak Jha, and probably Mr. Rajat Misra to present. And I welcome all of you to this occasion with your very young and energetic viewpoints regarding this special issue on the social media and COVID. It is well known that we cannot get out of social media. In fact, our college teachers and the department students have made a survey during COVID, and as I have made a cursory attempt, I have seen that most of the respondents, there was I think more than 100 respondents, have replied that they have heard that everything else from social media. Very few, only 4 or 5% from different official journals or like that. Maximum more than 95% from social media. So social media has been a very important part of our life. Those who are like me, a senior by age, we have a little idea about social media, but it is fact that it cannot get escape from social media. We know that the 2019 novel coronavirus or the extreme severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus have spread all over the world, particularly in India and in Bengal. And whatever the source may be, but the fact is that the public needs access to timely and reliable information. I personally feel that the situation becomes somewhat a abracadabra if the access to timely and reliable information is not there. Social media has a responsibility, but they are as such not bound by the governmental machinery. They have their own priorities also. In that case, a people institution develops. Actually, you see that social media nowadays has become a first and effective platform for searching, for sharing, distributing all information, particularly this health information. Social media serves to provide an important informal source of data to identify all information that has not been reported to general medical departments. But this channel of disseminating knowledge sometimes mixed with care tactics, discrimination, misleading reports, and conspiracy theories related to the origin of the virus, its spread, and mass buying of all items like face masks, injury, infomedia, social media networks. So in that case, we cannot get escaped from the social media perspective about which we are aware, but the fact is that we sometimes become confused whether we know social media or social media knows ourselves. That means whether we are with social media or social media with us. In that case, the DG of the WHO some time ago has told us that a battle has against these false theories and conspiracy theories regarding misinformation, which creates confusion, spreads fear, hampers the responses, and we people, general people particularly, we have to remain ourselves very scared about this fact, and sometimes we have to take into account these expectations of people. We say that are unnecessary expectations created by the social media. So far as I know, during this lockdown period, so far as my relatives are concerned, they are so much eager to know the information every evening or at any time regarding this corona, but without knowing the fact whether they are taking information or misinformation. This is a very important aspect which about to be analyzed in this. I think that today's webinar will deal with all the things. So, social networking has definitely a positive process. And I told that after that after China, India is the maximum user of this social media, social networking, and we can't we can say that we live on social media nowadays. It has been that regarding this coronavirus, it is a non-pharmaceutical intervention. We know that the pharmaceutical intervention is there. It is definitely it is important, but non-pharmaceutical intervention which fulfills this purpose of non-pharmaceutical intervention. It has been a strong platform for spreading public health awareness and advocacy regarding public health issues. We have to do this, and we know that in India particularly, we have developed a app like Arogya Setu, and which is very important for the purpose of controlling the disease as well as disseminating the information. The importance is of so high level that we cannot ignore. Rather, we can have to invite a specialist to know the intervention purposes perspective of this them to offer this misinformation. But it is true that we have misinformation, and it becomes very dangerous for general people to have a very important area to have an appropriate idea about this virus. It is also true that vandalism of professional image is also there. A major risk is there related to the unethical content that the social media serves, that the social media induces, and convey information about many things else out of this content. Sometimes they give information regarding personality, beliefs, interests, which are not at all related with this coronavirus or this our pandemic. So in that case, we have to think about that how to use this. There are ways by which the low standard quality of information is also disseminated. I don't know whether it is true or not, but the fact is that the social media, particularly YouTube, Facebook, etc., are often used just for getting views and followers without any content. The disseminators want a number of followers, a number of viewers, whether they are appropriate or not, this is not the matter. How many likes they have, this is also important. And in that way, the low standard quality of information becomes an appropriate place for analysis. That simple numbering of this information, simple number of followers, whether that can be cited as a standardization procedure. And for myself, the low standard quality of information is sometimes linked with this type of vandalism, this type of followership escalation. It is also true a type of fear-mongering environment is also created by social media. Social media often a type of fear psychosis develops. People becomes very much afraid of these areas, and in that way, the misinformation includes many things like disease statistics, medications, methods of prevention, nutritional guidelines. We have seen a number of areas are there where misinformations are disseminated. But those who are very much aware about this outbreak of Zika in 2015 or the yellow fever in 2016, at that time also this type of fear-mongering environment was created, and that was particularly by the social media. And the time has not come, but it can be said that in this year also, social media has a role. Well, creation is not out of our orbit. We can find it also. To conclude, it will say that a potentially dangerous misinformation has been generated. Whether we accept it or not, it has been disseminated, this dangerous misinformation, via the social networks. Because this the facets of epidemic, which often threatens public safety and aggravates crisis. This has been also a part of this social media activities. The false rumor as well as the dissemination of the information often runs faster than the virus, and in that case, it creates a second layer of pandemic. Uh, 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 Various methods of correcting this misinformation is highly necessary. It is true that the virus, as it is spreading very quickly, we are having a number of lessons too. We will have more lessons in near futures, and definitely it will serve as a blueprint for coping with future pandemics. Uh, in the near future, we will have a new type of management through this social network. And in this moment also, we have a discussion regarding this positive and the negative role of the social media, particularly India, as the second largest user of social media in the world, cannot ignore its responsibility in the world. In the world itself, India has a responsibility to steward, to manage the social media so that it becomes helpful for the individuals. I hope that in today's seminar or webinar, our special speakers will delve deep into this aspect and will enlighten us with the facts of the for our general people, that how we can get free from this of social media and full social media, which is necessary for our country as well as the world. I, on behalf of the college, convey my heartfelt thanks to Meenakshi for organizing such a good webinar, as well as I convey my heartfelt thanks to the speakers and also the participants, those who have assembled here today. I again, though belated, on behalf of on the day of the Teachers' Day, as it is very near, and I welcome all of you to remain present and to have very good discussions and have your opinion also. My request to the speakers that please discuss, considering the fact, college and from this country, and considering the fact that the students and the participants or the viewers of the rural areas also have a necessity to have an idea. I hope that you will do justice to your work, and thank you all. Thank you. Ministry Award.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much for your valuable insights on the issue of social media pertaining to relevant issues that you have covered. Now I would like to call upon Dr. Runa Das Chaudhary, HOD, Department of Sociology.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir. And thank you for the invitation and for your kind words of introduction. I'll straight come to the topic, social media perspectives from China and the world. I think Professor Das Chaudhary talked about the good and bad uses of social media and how possibly we should think about it. And I think an hour ago, I was just scanning through, and there was a story about how coronavirus depression, there has been a spike despite social media. In these times of coronavirus, the spike has been in depression. So you see, social media is no substitute for real life. And I think that is also true for so many other aspects, including countries, democracy, politics, and the way we have seen the world. So I think now that we are talking about social media perspectives, a couple of things, outliners, which we need to keep in mind. We are all social media users. I think this generation, current generation in India, is possibly using social media more than ever before. And that's not just true for India, that's also true for the rest of the world. So a few things are common, whether be it Corona or without Corona, or I think not in just India, but other parts of the world, including China and beyond that. So one thing is that it's about message. I think what we try to do in social media, we try to exchange message of all kinds. And I think in this audience, several people for sure are communication experts, and every message has certain motive. There's a purpose behind it. Often that purpose may be to make somebody laugh, to make somebody cry, to get some votes, to get some religious support, or to generate support for the government. There may be different purposes for that, but every message has got a motive. It has a reason behind it. We do not communicate just for the sake of communication or just talking. Even if we are talking to ourselves, even that has a purpose. So now that message has a motive, and then of course information comes in, and information and purpose and motive, when they all get in together, then we have a phenomena of something called disinformation that can also be there. So when a message which has a motive, then there are two possibilities. It can convert into an information, it can convert into a disinformation. Information, I think, now there is a very, very small line, there is a fine line in between dividing these two. When you know the origin of any information and you know the motivation behind it, if you know these two factors that lies behind an information and behind any message for that matter, you can call it an information which you can use for your own purpose. But if you do not know where the message has originated and what is its motivation, and you just get carried away by what has been just said, and the reason can be many, maybe your lack of information about its origin or motivation, or simply your lack of enthusiasm to find it out. And then that same message, which could have been information, can become disinformation. So if I get a message on WhatsApp about something, about possibly that, well, Corona can be cured by some magic trick, some sort of trick. I think you would have all got all sorts of message about how drinking hot water can cure Corona, maybe, or possibly not just in Corona times, but even otherwise, all sorts of message that on religious lines, on caste lines, on regional lines. These messages have certain motives, and we do tend to believe in this. And I think the majority tends to believe in this, which is where the things need to change. So I think the key has to be that if you want to use social media, or for that matter, any media, I think even when we read newspaper, if we do not pay attention to the fact that why the story has been published, why the editor has written it the way it has been written, I think if you are not able to figure that out, you have lost the purpose. So I think this is something which is we all need to pay very, very keen attention to whenever we are not just on social media. Social media, we need to be particularly careful, because social media is a decentralized form of mass media where almost everybody tries to become a journalist. And then whatever information comes to them, they just dish it out. And I think that creates a lot of problems. It has already started creating all sorts of challenges. It has some benefits as well, substantial benefits. I think many elections are being fought. At least politicians have definitely got reason to have social media the way it is. But I think if you see the broader trends in society, there are, you see all sorts of good information, opportunities, interaction. This has become much more easier. So of course there are positives, but we see a serious challenge for disinformation, and particularly through social media, because in social media there's almost everybody, and it's all free kind of thing. So we need to sort of draw in a line somewhere. And we need to be careful about whenever we see a message, we need to ask these two questions. Where has it originated? And what is the motivation behind? If you are satisfied with both these things, accept it. Otherwise, I think you should start questioning. And I think we all should start questioning. Now, when it comes to, again, now what we are talking today is not just India, but perspectives from China and the world. But then India, of course, is a very, very huge country where if you see the data from Facebook or Twitter, or for that matter, any social media, mostly Western platforms, India is almost one of the top users. The number of users, the volume in India is substantial. TikTok, which was recently banned, almost 1/4, 1/5 of its users were in India. I think that's true for almost every platform. You name it, and it's all there, because we have got population, and it's young. We have digital penetration rising. All these phenomena are pushing. And I think, of course, in Corona times, the data definitely says, and there's all the reason that people have gone more on it rather than because of the restrictions on public life. So you see, social media has, it has, in India, happens to be a very, very important cosmos in all of this. Now, why is this all happening, and how is it all happening? Whatever is happening with social media, how countries are using it? It has, I think, if we observe those things, there are a couple of 3-4 things that can be pointed out again. First of all, you have economic issues have come in, particularly during the current times, but even otherwise, I think if you see the way liberalization has done things with world, it has basically increased disparities. It has created inequalities, substantial inequalities. If you see in India's case, and even for that matter, any country, if you take the case of US or Europe as well, the Gini coefficient, which is a measurement of inequality, the one that used to be the Gini coefficient in the 1950s and 60s in the US, it has substantially gone up, which means that inequality has gone up. So even if the economy is growing up, that does not mean that people are becoming richer. Not all of them, definitely. So you see, if inequality keeps on increasing, that means economy is faltering anyways, with or without COVID. Of course, COVID has accentuated this entire process. So we see economy faltering substantially during these times, and this is highlighting other fault lines of societies, among countries, among communities, on all sorts of imaginable lines, be it religion, be it caste, be it creed, be it race in America for that matter, or something else. Second very important factor, of course, has been in recent years is that there has been a proliferation of internet access, and a substantial number of young people in particular are on internet, and they're using these social media platforms. I think if you ask me, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I came on Facebook. I had an email ID after I came in my bachelor's degree. Now there are people who have a Facebook account before they're born. So things have dramatically changed, and they're starting to use it when they're 6, 7 years of age. By 10 or 12, 13, many kids have boyfriends and girlfriends and all sorts of relationships. This was unimaginable just a couple of decades ago. So you see, there have been substantial proliferation of the internet, and young people are there. And then, of course, if you see not just current times, COVID in particular has accentuated it, but even otherwise, we are in a situation of government versus media, and that's true for social media as well. I think when you are talking about China, and I think I will be talking about several other countries, you see that how, especially whenever a crisis comes, governments are happily are ready to pounce on media. I was recently at a conference in which there were journalists from Bangladesh and Pakistan and several other South Asian countries, and they all had similar things to say, because COVID-19 has literally brought down media on its knee, and the governments are happy basically taking to task media organizations and journalists who could create problem for them, or who were on the wrong side of the divide. So you see, this is another factor. And then, of course, there is something that is the subject of, and we'd have heard about cases of disinfectants and all sorts of weird things being sprayed over people, mostly poor. And then, of course, I think some, tricks and trades that, well, how you would get cured with this, or how you can fix this or that. Actually, most of this, unfortunately, happens to be disinformation. And if you're not able to figure it out, you have a problem. So now this is a problem not just specific to us. This is a problem which is specific to every country. And this creates, in some cases, political issues, at others, social issues. And I think there have been so many stories and so many incidents which have come recently. I'll just like to go through a few which has been fairly common across the world. Then I will come to the specific countries' cases. There have been several cases of attack on doctors, not just across the world, especially in countries where coronavirus was relatively not handled properly. And in most parts of the world, I think even in developed countries for that matter, coronavirus handling has come into question because almost no health system found itself to be amply prepared for a crisis of this scale. So we have seen that. And of course, this has happened more in poor countries, in countries where conservatism is high. I think yesterday there was a report in Pakistan. I think not just yesterday, there have been several reports in several countries, including our own India itself, where people have said all sorts of things and they have attacked doctors. And I think politicians are also to be blamed for that. And when we think that, well, possibly these are things which are happening in poor countries, but no, I think disinformation is something which is happening in rich countries as well. There was a recent survey, which the report was published by the BBC, and it said that 28% of Americans believe that Bill Gates wants to use vaccine to implant microchips in people. And if you, there's an average American data. If you go among Republicans in particular, the Trump supporters, who are considered to be relatively closer to religion and conservatism, the percentage is 44%. So I think 44% of Republicans believing that Bill Gates does this. Well, I think that is something I would leave it to Americans. Now, coming to another factor, if you see, even in other developed countries, such as Italy, for example, there has been a strong anti-vaccination, almost a movement sort of thing. So there are people who are saying on social media that, well, people are using pandemic for profit. There was an Italian video, very popular. It was watched by almost 700,000 times on Facebook. And the caption on it says that, well, the pandemic has been invented. And this is something which is still being discussed in several countries. I'm not getting into the science of it. There are serious and genuine doubts about whether the rushing of vaccines and whatever medicine is being done. I think we have a lot more reason to question the way I think medical industry works, health industry works in general. But I think most of these, they are mostly based upon unfounded facts, and that is a real problem. In India, of course, I think we have had serious issues in terms of some people getting bathed in cow dung. And well, I'm sure that, well, if there is a benefit, you got to research it, you got to find it out. But just because some WhatsApp message has come that you start doing it, I think that is something that we should be very, very careful about. So these all things are happening not just in Western countries and developed countries, but in developing countries, in Africa, in Australia, in Canada, in Latin America. And we'll take some cases, including China, of course. Now, if you take the case of China, let's come to China in particular, because now Chinese media in general, you would have heard that there is hardly anything. It's all government control, and the social media is fairly controlled, which is, by the way, I think substantially true. I used to cover social media on a regular basis, including media as well. And I can tell you for sure that, well, if you happen to have a view which is against the Chinese government, then I think it's very difficult for it to survive on social media. Though you can write it, you can post it, but most likely it will be deleted sooner than later. But at the same time, you'll have to give the credit to the Chinese people that in China, I think you see the number of internet users is even more substantial. It's a country where you have one language, so they do not have a diversity, the kind of diversity that we have in India. In the entire country, almost 1.4 billion people, they speak one language. So whenever something happens, something, and they have found ways of trying to circumvent the government censorship. At times they use pictures, at that times they use memes, or at times they use expressions which the censors may not be able to figure out. And then immediately within an hour, maybe it is viewed by almost millions of people. So a normal trend, I think, in India, I think on Twitter, if you have 10,000 of tweets coming on a subject, it starts tweeting. Now, I think in Chinese social media, Weibo for that matter, or WeChat for that matter, I think 10,000 is not even the bottom trends number. I think the top trends are something like 500,000, 2 million, 3 million, that sort of number is there. So you see the entire country is on one language, one social media, most of them. So I think the trends have started picking up very, very fast. The numbers are very, very substantial. And so, of course, there's a cat and mouse game going between the government, the censors, and the people who have a different view. But at the same time, I think you see opinion does come out at times. But then that does not last. The moment the government comes to note it, they tend to delete it, they tend to censor it, And of course, under current President Xi Jinping, these targets and these tendencies have grown substantially. Now, how actually, essentially, what are the things happening in the case of current times, I think even otherwise for that matter, is that I think in general, whatever you see in the Chinese newspapers, they try to promote those similar trends, and they try to promote those kind of views. They also censor a lot, and which is how they also try to trend things at times. By the way, I think you have to give credit to the Chinese government for that matter, that they have learned from the failure of Soviet Russia, and they have worked very, very hard, and they are still working very, very hard to stay in the good books of the people. Of course, not all the times they are, but I think they tried, and more often than not, at least the evidence says that, well, they have been able to do it. Including in current times, COVID-19. I think if you see the Chinese social media, President Xi started with the call of People's War, and those things started trending on Weibo. They were very, very popular. And there was after there was initial bossed-up response when the outbreak first happened in Wuhan, in central China. There were, of course, some criticism and heavy criticism, but the government immediately sort of took note of it. And I think now things are back to normal. You also have to give credit to the people's psychology in general, everywhere for that matter, not just in China. People are gullible. They tend to forget things. So one thing happens, and after a few weeks, something else happens, and they tend to forget it. So the governments have definitely realized it, and they use it to their advantage. And of course, Chinese media and the Chinese government in particular has a history of Communist Party of China has a history of using communication and media to its advantage in a substantial way. By the way, this is not just happening in China, but China domestically. But China is trying to mold opinion and social media using social media to basically shape opinion in other countries as well. A very good example would be to talk about the case of what China is doing in Arab countries. This is especially important because you would have heard about what China is doing in Xinjiang and what China is doing with minorities in Tibet and other parts of China. But at the same time, I think you would have also heard that, of course, Pakistan doesn't criticize China, but most of the Arab countries also choose not to criticize China, and not just a true for government, actually. It's actually seeping in through among the people. So, for example, how do they do it? So, of course, there is export and import and propaganda through mainstream media, but in social media as well. Chinese diplomats have become very, very active over the years on the social media of the local country, and this is more the case in countries such as the Arab countries. So, and what they talk about on those social media platforms, they actually talk about the life of Muslims, for example, in China. And they highlighted that, see how good life is maintained. Muslims lead a good life in China. And this is, and I think if you go to Xinjiang, actually, if you go to Xinjiang, or for that matter, in Mongolia, or for that matter, any part of China, the infrastructure is good. You can't really see any sort of poverty or distress the way you would possibly see in South Asian countries or African countries or many other parts of the world. So it's easy for them. So, they share those videos, they share those things. Of course, there are some people who have benefited out of economic policies, so they highlight such policies alone. And they work with the mainstream media, they work with the local influencers, including on social media. And this is where they follow very, 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 well orchestrated strategy of China and the things that the Chinese government wants. And another strategy that apply in this, not just in Arab countries, but in Latin America and other parts of the world, is that they use local language. So you'll have possibly some Chinese officials or some Chinese influencers or traders who trade with China, Arabic speaking, or for that matter, local languages speaking, and they basically promote the agenda of the country. And they do it very, very organized. You have CGT in Arabic, which has accumulated almost 14 million followers on Facebook. 14 million is a substantial number by any count. And there are many Chinese diplomats who are fluent in Arabic language. CGTN, the Chinese official television English language, it has got reporters, including local ones, And then, of course, some Chinese who are very good and fluent in Arabic language. In other countries, they put, for example, in Brazil, they will have Spanish speaking, or in other countries, they will have some local language. In Arab, they have Arabic speaking. And they do it in an organized way to make this happen. By the way, this is not something just China is doing. Other countries have also picked it up. Russia is doing it substantially. So if you see the Russian RT, which is the Russian television channel, State On, so it has got a Spanish version, and it has its commentator. If you take one example for that matter, its commentator Ina Afinogenova. She is very popular on YouTube because of her, because she speaks Spanish, and of course, I think she does US bashing substantially. Of course, that goes in favor of Russia, and ultimately there are anti-American sentiments or whatever sentiments that Russia wants to be not in focus or in focus. And so, they have built up, they have invested in such star performers, local and exported, and this is how they essentially try to build an audience. For example, there was one video on 4th of August in which Afinogenova made fun of US President Donald Trump's allegation that TikTok social media was being used by China for espionage purpose. And this is how essentially of course, there are some people who are willing to like it. Okay. Now, I think beyond that, if you take the case of Lebanon, there has been a bomb blast recently. There was a lot of hue and cry about negligence and management, and the people have come out in the street, but the outpouring first began on social media. So you see, social media is not just about generating public opinion; it's also about seeking political mobilization. You would have heard about Hong Kong, how substantially there was social media mobilization through Telegram in particular, and how, of course, it became very, very extensive level of protest. Of course, recently, because of some new laws, national security law, it has become much more difficult. But then again, it's still the social media in contest, because they're trying to figure it out. The same case with Iran. If you see, for example, there was a case in July 2019 where judiciary sentenced 3 young men to death for participating in a protest last November. And there was a huge public outcry, mostly over social media, and the Iranian Supreme Court decided to basically do a retrial of the 3 young men. Similar cases have happened in Hong Kong, where I just mentioned, and it's still happening. The battle is ongoing. It hasn't really ended. And if you see the case, for example, you'd have heard about the Legislative Council elections, which were postponed by a year. The huge outcry began from social media, and of course, it continues in some or the other way, which is why possibly the national security law is now targeting dissidents or people who are not in line with the Chinese government on social media and via social media, tracking them. They're keeping a track of it. Similar again in Belarus, for example, there was this. You'd have heard about this Lukashenko, Alexander Lukashenko, who happened to be the president. There was elections on 9th of August, and this time the election campaign happened to be, I think in general, by the way, in Belarus, the country's media is totally dominated by the government. But so this time Lukashenko again thought that possibly it will be a cakewalk, but then social media, the opposition used it substantially, and while the state was using television, they were all on social media, and it becomes very, very popular. And you would have heard about protests, and of course, almost his 26-year rule is under threat. So you see, there has been almost a revolution of social networks across the world in different ways. Some countries for political reform, somewhere for other. For example, in Cuba, if you take the case of Cuba, which was a communist country and still a lot of economic issues, there also social media is being used substantially to voice dissent against the government. If you take the case of Bangladesh, there was this advertisement on social media, and there was this scam about COVID-19 test report being given through fraud, because those Bangladeshis who want to go to foreign countries or for studies or education, they were being given negative results for bribe. So this led to social media outcry, and of course counter and miscounter. Actually, there are people who actually tried to promote it, and at the same time, there were of course counters. So you see, both streams are happening even in relatively countries which were possibly totally disconnected with social media till just a couple of decades ago. Something similar happened in Nepal as well. So when in June there were protests broke out in Kathmandu, and during which people started demanding better response from the government to deal with the pandemic. And the Prime Minister of Nepal, Nepalese Prime Minister KP Oli, he made light of Corona, light of the disease, saying Corona is like flu, it contracted, you should sneeze and drink hot water and it will go away. And that clip somehow became viral. You see, now in social media, if such a statement, if you make fun of Corona or whatever, and if it goes viral on social media, then it becomes a huge embarrassment. I think politicians a generation ago or a couple of generations ago would have almost gone away with anything. Nobody would have noted such things. But now is a time when sometimes even out of context quote happens, which is unfortunate. That becomes disinformation. But sometimes genuine things, such as a prime minister making light of Corona, like Corona kind of disease, went viral. It was a lot of it almost came to his neck. He almost lost his seat. And beyond that, in Europe as well, in several countries, such things are happening. If you see cases of political use, then in Europe as well, I think I think in France and Italy and Germany and UK, which were the countries which are most affected, I think the government is strong, so they have mostly used social media for benefit, and I think the people are also educated, which is where they have been able to use it properly. But if you take some case of some other countries, such as Slovenia, for example, the prime minister was almost waging war against media in the COVID pandemic. So you see, and the Slovenian prime minister Janez Janša, he has always been known for targeting media, and this has been a special time for that. And similar, the autocratic response of leaders in Armenia and some other countries have also come in criticism. I think I don't want to use other speakers' time, so I'd like to conclude now by saying that, well, you see, if you take the case of across the world, then there have been several cases of information and disinformation and how social media has been put to use and disuse and misuse. So we need to learn from these mistakes and use it for proper purpose. We should not let social media become a tool for all sorts of religious and caste related or region related or for that matter any kind of disinformation. That is something very, very bad in taste. Or neither should the government be let to target opposition leaders. For example, you would have heard about Navalny being targeted in Russia, or for that matter, several leaders being arrested in several other countries. The government in India as well definitely seems to be on the forefront rather than forefoot rather than back foot when it comes to media. So what we do see is that in general as well, but especially in times of crisis, you have social media being used to undermine democracy, stoke abuses, and there are several examples of that. And this is so unfortunate because you use a platform to strengthen democracy. You use a platform to strengthen communication. You use a platform to strengthen the entire process, which makes societies better and more mature, more saner, and more inclusive. If the purpose is on the contrary, and the test has to be in times of crisis. And what technology could be called to be a good technology if in crisis it backfires? So I think these are some of the lessons that we need to learn and possibly need to ponder upon. I think this is how we need to understand social media perspectives, not just in China and the world, but including India as well. Thank you. Hello.
And several other ways it's being used. So for every fact, the problem is that there is a counterfact, and all these counterfacts and the facts, they look identical online, which is becoming very confusing to the people. And as the coronavirus spreads, so does the epidemic of misinformation. And I'm sure that the way in which different countries, and especially we're highlighting on the case of China, how there has been a well-orchestrated and organized way to do propaganda through the social media in shaping public opinion. There have been positive stories about promoting Chinese Communist Party's pandemic response, etc., and also about responses of not only politicians but also people, policymakers, on the ways in which, the extent to which the the social media should be, should kind of extend its arm, to affect people's life, to have an impact on people's lives. So there has to be some kind of as you were saying, a fine line between, information and misinformation. And how is it that, there has to be, know-how about the origin and the intention behind every information. So one needs to check before, believing in any story. So thank you, Dr. Jha, again, for your very engaging lecture. And now I would move on to introduce the second invited keynote speaker of today's webinar, Mr. Sumit Chaturvedi. Mr. Sumit Chaturvedi is an independent journalist and researcher. He has worked as a Right to Information Fellow with the Government of India, as a public policy scholar with the Hindu Center for Politics and Public Policy, and also as an UNESCO Sahapedia Research Fellow. He writes on politics, public policy, and socio-political issues. His works have been published in various print and online publications such as the Economic and Political Weekly, First Post, India Spend, and The Wire, and many others. Two of his publications have been included in the libraries of Indian Parliament and the United States Congress. He maintains a blog by the name of opiniontandoor.in. Today he will be presenting, and the topic of his presentation today is titled as Social Media and Democratization, Reactionism from Dominant Groups Against Progressive Democratization. So on behalf of the BA General Committee of Bamunpukur Himayun Kabir Mahavidyalaya, I welcome you to this webinar, and we are especially thankful to you for having agreed to present your paper at such a short notice. So thank you for that. And I would now request you to deliver your lecture. Over to you, Mr. Chaturvedi.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Thank you so much to the college for inviting me. And while my topic is not directly related to COVID-19 as such, but the topic in itself, I suppose, is relevant across times and even during this current crisis. As the speaker before me, Dr. Jha, has illustrated about a lot of authoritarian regimes and state-controlled regimes where not only media, but social media is also heavily regulated, and also in some cases, as he said, is also manipulated to manufacture public opinion and public mandate. It's a nice contrast to the topic that I'm trying to present, which is about democratic regime like India. Before that, just to provide a certain backdrop to the topic in relation to the topic which we are addressing, which is about COVID-19. In the light of the Black Lives Movement, which started in the US a few weeks ago, in fact, a few months ago, there was this info meme on Instagram, which I read, which was about that since a lot of economic activity and essentially a big part of capitalism has been suspended during this pandemic, and people are very much engaged to the entire world, as their need also has been established to be so through social media. So they are engaged with the world through social media in this time of pandemic. They are all the more concerned about a lot of issues which are going on around them. So that's why when the Black Lives Movement started, there was a huge mobilization of people in the US, because essentially the economic activity was suspended, and people had time to connect with each other through the social media, and they were able to participate in different kind of activism. And that's why we saw it as a continuing movement even here today, and it resonated across countries. So my topic is about social media and democratization, which is basically about the power balance between dominant groups and the vulnerable groups. Now, even in India, if I try to relate it to the COVID-19 situation, we saw that during the initial phase of the breakout in March, a particular community was targeted in a big way for the spread of COVID-19 pandemic, and there was a huge onslaught of media attention, both the mainstream media, that is print and electronic, as well as social media, targeting a particular community. And now recently a high court suggested that that was an unfortunate trend, and it was also unfair to that particular community. So we see that how certain vulnerable sections are easily targeted through media, and especially through social media. So since I'm a student of both political science and journalism, my topic and as well as my lecture resonates on it. It basically is at the intersection of politics and communication. So first of all, I would like to give a brief idea what I mean by democratization. So basically, democracy is not a static concept. It's not like that you say that it's a democracy and everything goes democratically. We have to constantly keep working to make a democracy more democratic, and realize it in a substantive and in its essence. And that's what democratization is all about. As eminent sociologist Max Weber has said, that democratization is a process of leveling field between the ruled and the rulers. But in a broader sense, it's about the leveling of field between different groups. And in this case, which I'm trying to present today, it's about the leveling field between the dominant groups and the vulnerable groups. Now, about democracy, when I talk about social media, there is a particular aspect of democracy that I'm trying to look at, which is discursive democracy. Now, democracy is, as we know, there is participatory democracy. You go into elections, you participate in elections. That's one aspect of participatory democracy. You have different ways to engage with bureaucracy, such as Right to Information Act and other kinds of ways of engaging with your elected representatives and others. That's participatory democracy. What I'm talking about here is discursive democracy, where you basically talk about realizing democracy through discourse, public discourse, and how you engage in that public space. Now, public space, if you look at mediums of communication, are a big part of public discourse. It basically creates that space in which public discourse is held, and how it is mobilized, and what are the results, how it plays out in the public space. So these mediums are very important. Initially, we had print media, which came about as a big form of public space for these public discourses. Then with the advance in technology came electronic media. And now then we had online media. And in the last 15 to 20 years, we have social media. So social media is I think it's the biggest explosion of the public space until now. And never before has the public space for public discourse been expanded to such a great extent as it has been with the social media. If you look at print media, initially print media was the space which was created by those whose voices were not represented in the public discourse, because public discourse was in the 16th century when print media came along. The public space was mainly controlled by the authorities, by the king and the sovereign. And print media came as a form of expressing oneself. Even in India, when we look at our independence movement, most of the activists, and they used print media to further their ideas, to present it to different people. And that's why we even saw so many attempts by the British forces, British colonial forces, to regulate that print media. So print media was that big change in the public space to basically influence and to basically mobilize public discourse from those who were not adequately represented in the public space. But as time grew, even print media became corporatized. It became like an industry. And like it happens with all industries, it kind of aligned with the dominant economic and political interest as well, because they have a way of aligning themselves together, because they have similar interests and similar ends. But when social media came along about 15 to 20 years back, it basically started as a medium of communication where people could just, share with each other their lives and their different aspects, which they were not able to share with them physically, and also to be able to reconnect with a lot of people with whom they might have lost touch with. But when social media slowly and steadily, as since politics is an essential aspect of our lives, in sharing our own personal lives, we started slowly also sharing our political views, which is a big aspect of our lives. And as soon as the idea of sharing the views, and as soon as those options were enabled to share your views, to share your stories and all those things, the whole idea of the public space being exploded by unimaginable dimensions, that also came into play. So that was when social media also came to be politicized. Now, social media is very different from mainstream media because, as I said, print media slowly and steadily came to be corporatized, and independent print initiatives slowly witnessed a decline. More and more cross-media ownership and mass media ownership was seen, where certain groups were owning different mediums, and especially when it happened with print, advertisements from the government and from different industries and from big businesses were cornered by a few select print initiatives, and we saw a decline in independent print initiatives in most democracies, including India. With electronic media, it was never the case that it was open to a lot of independent voices, because it was very highly technology based medium, and therefore it could be afforded by only a select few. It could not be afforded by everyone. So print and electronic were no longer those spaces where independent voices, or those which were not adequately represented, those groups could have been represented there. So there came the idea of social media, which was a big hit amongst those groups which were not given adequate representation in mainstream media. And these groups were the vulnerable groups a lot of the times, who were not getting representation, not just in terms of their stories being shared, but also being themselves the deliverer of the message that they wanted to. But social media changed that. It allowed a certain democratization in terms of leveling up the field between the dominant groups and the vulnerable groups. And a lot of vulnerable groups then started to create their own messages and shared it with the people on social media. And the enabling of the sharing of these views helped them to reach out to audiences which they had no access to ever before. So the very idea of social media being an open and affordable space gave avenue to those groups and sections who were giving out their views for probably the first time in the history of democracies. And this at the same time, so as we know, dominant groups, if they have that kind of monopoly or hegemony over public discourse, they will automatically not like idea of their power over the discourse being challenged. So at that time came a power struggle, and right from the time that the vulnerable groups were trying to give out their ideas, mobilize their ideas, around the same time, the dominant groups were also discovering the power of this medium, because it was open and accessible to everyone. Dominant groups here, which I'm referring to, are those which are resourceful, which have always been resourceful, which do not only have had the economic capital, but also have had the social capital. And so basically these dominant groups wanted to also capitalize on the opportunity of the social media to not just give out their own version of the story, but also to counteract the democratization which was happening in terms of communication from the vulnerable groups or erstwhile not adequately represented groups. So here, dominant groups, as I have written about it in some of my articles, I have looked at dominant groups specifically to see what are the basic components of their narratives when they use social media. And although I have looked at a larger perspective from print to electronic as well, but here I'm talking about social media. And there are two kinds of narratives that the dominant groups have tried to mobilize through social media. First are those narratives which are aimed at denouncing certain constitutional provisions or legal provisions which are aimed at benefiting or protecting or for the progress of vulnerable or marginalized groups. And the second kind of narratives are those which are aimed at asserting the traditional narratives of glory, prestige, and social superiority of the dominant groups. Often it is accompanied by the berating of the vulnerable or marginalized groups as well. So there are two kinds of narratives, and here it is a paradoxical situation. While the first kind of narrative is about the dominant groups trying to project themselves as the victims of certain constitutional legal provisions. So for instance, a few years back, there was this backlash against the SC/ST Prevention Atrocity Prevention Act. Also, there is this constant bickering about reservations. So they try to project that narrative that how it basically victimizes the dominant groups, and so they try to bring their own version how it should be counteracted. And at the same time, if what I've seen through my studies is that the dominant, for instance, those certain dominant caste groups also try to project their social superiority and take their caste pride, Savarna pride. So that's a paradoxical situation, that at the same time that they are trying to project themselves as the victims, they are also trying to project themselves as the socially superior groups. So that's basically the twofold strategy of the dominant groups when they are using social media. There are many social media groups which are associated with the organization and associations which are basically functioning on the ground, which are basically run by the dominant groups. And they use social media to circulate their views, arguments, and sometimes even false narratives and on the social media to this end. Now, the peculiar thing about social media, as Dr. Jha had also pointed out, is that here you have a lot of people sharing their views, and it's basically has opened up the source of information for everyone. So if and then also if you compare it to electronic and print, where there are few speakers and they are also open to a degree of public scrutiny, they have some degree of accountability, and therefore there is some kind of authority. Social media does those kinds of checks and balances. It is open to everyone to share their own views. There is not so much of public scrutiny because there is such a wide amount of content. So not everything can be judged through public scrutiny unless it emerges as a trend on Twitter or something like that. People do try to scrutinize these narratives, but it is virtually impossible to look at all kinds of narratives which are flowing through different mediums of social media, especially if you look at the not so public content is being circulated through that kind of media. So there is not that much kind of public scrutiny involved there, and if it is, and it's also not so much about information, but it's about the narrative. And in case of narrative, the idea is that in communication medium, if the narrative suits your frame of reference, you are more likely to adhere to it, to accept it, or to acknowledge it, and accept it in a way that it gets further mobilized. So the idea here is that social media enables this. So in a way, the idea of democratization of source of information here counteracts the idea of democracy in itself, that it does not have those checks and balances which are there in other forms of media. So therefore, if you look at discursive democracy, if you look at the discursive democracy which is created by opening up of public space or creation of public space for public discourse, either through print, and you see this trend then through social media as well, that while in certain points of time, the new emerging media have been responsible for democratization of discourse, that same opportunity which is provided by those mediums is also used by the other dominant groups whose hegemony and monopoly might be challenged by the emerging narratives, by the emerging groups. And there is this kind of reactionism, there is a reactionary movement against the new process of democratization which is happening through these mass medium of communication. So there is this inherent design, I would not like to say it a flaw, but there is an inherent design structure to all kinds of media in discursive democracy. If you look at it from the perspective of discursive democracy, that the spaces or mediums for public discourse by the logic of democracy are open for all. And since dominant interests align often with politically and emotionally well-offs, it becomes easier for dominant groups to dominate these spaces and mediums for public discourse as well. And since dominant groups have also used social media platforms, this democratic tool of social media has come to be used for attacking some of the basic constitutional provisions. So this is the second kind of contradiction that I would like to point out, is that when we talk about the democratic potential of mediums, we should always look at if it is just about democracy or is it also about upholding of constitutional values. So when you are opening up a space in a true democratic spirit, we have to look at if it is also being used to counteract the very basic logic of a constitutional democracy as well, where certain constitutional provisions which are meant for a more equitable and equal society, are those provisions being attacked by the use of these democratic mediums. Now, in 21st century, social media has become almost inextricable from democracy. So social media is a legitimate part of democracies. Most political parties are now advertising on social media. Recently, the story was reported in Wall Street Journal that how a Facebook executive was involved in influencing the decisions of Facebook in not acting against the interest of a particular political party which is in power. So we see that how there is this aligning of political interest and capitalist interest along with this democratic public space, and yet its credential as a democratic public space cannot be discounted, because so many people who do not have access to be represented in mainstream electronic and print media are using still social media to give out their versions. And often, if you look at the kind of stories which are sometimes run by mainstream media, sometimes the groups which are most hard hit by these stories, they use social media to counteract these stories which are run on mainstream media and try to win back public opinion in their own favor. And these groups are mostly the vulnerable groups or the inadequately represented groups in mainstream media. So it is important to understand that while we are looking at the democratic potential of social media, we should also look at the constitutional impact of social media, and it should not be that the idea of democratization through social media should implode under its own weight, that it becomes such a heavy concept for its own existence that it implodes in itself and ends up harming constitutional values, which are directly meant for the upholding of not just procedural democracy, which is about elections and other procedures, but also the substantive meaning of democracy. So we should take care that constitutional provisions which are meant for ensuring that democracy is delivered in its essence to the people, in substance, not just in its own in the concept of it, in the term of it, but in its essence. Those provisions should not be weakened by the use of social media. I have basically come to the end of my lecture, but when I'm talking about the pandemic, we have come to rely on social media in an unprecedented way during this time, because this is our only medium to connect with the world at the present. And most of our work is also happening through internet. And so we are, more or less, we are all connected to social media much more than ever before. And after pandemic, this whole momentum which social media and internet has gained during this period will most likely carry on even during the post-pandemic period. And our politics and our communication will be influenced by this no matter what. So whatever lessons we are learning during this time and even from before, these lessons should inform our course forward after the pandemic is over, because we are going to look at its repercussions in the time to come. That's about what I wanted to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Chaturvedi, for your very engaging lecture. Mr. Chaturvedi has highlighted on the idea of social media, how it is different from traditional print media. How this how the social media has actually brought about a certain has allowed for a certain democratization, how vulnerable groups have been allowed a voice, and also about the fact that there are certain democratic potentials of social media, on the constitutional impact of social media, etc. So the idea is, since I'm a student of sociology, I have the idea that the one word that has caught my attention in your lecture, and with which I completely agree with, is the idea of narrative. So there are narratives, there are true narratives, there are false narratives. It's almost like that the pandemic has almost unleashed what I would say the Rashomon effect. You have so many narratives and, contending narratives, and you really do not know which narrative to be. I mean, in every war, the first casualty of every war is truth, and it's so true of the pandemic also, because I think the most serious casualty of this pandemic is truth. And again, of course, as I would say that there is no one single truth, or there cannot be one single truth, but there are always many truths, and we have to live with those many truths and make meaning out of those many truths. So I'm sure that our participants have many questions to ask. With this, I'll just move on to the formal Q&A session. So the first question, if I have been directed to Dr. Jha. So the first question goes out to Dr. Jha. It's from Srija Noshkar. And she asks, unlike how discourses arose about how COVID-19 has doubly affected the lives of Black communities in USA or people of color in UK, in China, there hasn't been any such information on how COVID might have affected the Uyghur Muslims. Uyghurs came about due to a general apathy and hatred towards China for being the source of virus. Why do you think this has happened?
Well, I think I already pointed out in my lecture that in general, the information communication ecosystem in China is substantially restricted, and it's all the more restricted in sensitive, they call it sensitive areas, such as Tibet and Xinjiang, and now even Hong Kong has become de facto very, very sensitive. So why this is happening, another extra factor is that in 2009, there was a riot in Xinjiang. And after that, they have dealt the region with even more heavy-handedness than they used to. So it has almost become a de facto police state, surveillance state. There are more cameras in Xinjiang per capita than any other part of the world, including in any other part of China. By the way, not just in Xinjiang, for that matter, cameras are there across China. I think for the first time you go to China, it almost pushes you into discomfort, because there is so much of camera in hostels and media organizations, lifts, and everywhere. I think we are also catching up, maybe, but for security purpose, but for law and order purpose. There, the camera is not just securing you; it's watching you, and that's the trouble. So I think there was this BBC journalist who actually did a story, and he basically just tried to violate a red light, and he just broke a couple of rules here and there, went to places where people were not supposed to go, and within 7-8 minutes, there was the police was looking for him. So you see the amount of I can tell you from my own experience. Now this is something which is not even imaginable, because Hangzhou, I lived in Hangzhou, I lived in Shanghai. Now in Hangzhou, it so happened that a friend of mine, he was from Kazakhstan, his bicycle was somehow stolen, from the university campus. And then we went to the police station and he told them, well, see, they call it bike, by the way. His bike has been stolen. And the policeman said, okay, fine, please sit down. He just did some couple of clicks on the camera and he said, okay, this is the guy who took your bicycle, and just phone call, and within half an hour, that guy was there. So you see, I think, so this is, of course, I think ultimately we settle, because till a certain limit of crime, they settle it. Now, in Xinjiang, this is on the other side, because the influx of Han Chinese has been very, very substantial. Almost, if you go to the city of Urumqi, which is the capital of Xinjiang, it's and not just Urumqi for that matter. Increasingly, even Lhasa is happening like that. Inner Mongolia's Hohhot, which is the capital of another minority-dominated province. Minority, not anymore dominated by the minority province. It's dominated more by Han, actually. So if you go there, I think it's all dominated by Han. The economic benefits that they claim has gone to the region, it has gone to the majority. So this has actually become even more restrictive. You have the cameras basically watch the minority. In general, in Xinjiang, you have 3 minority groups in particular, which are more under the watch of Chinese. You have Kazakhs, you have Turkish origin, other Turkish origin, Uzbeks as well, and then of course you have Uyghur Muslims. So Uyghur happens to be just one of the minorities among Xinjiang, and they are considered to be, the most sensitive. And basically they have done. You would have heard about the stories. They're heartbreaking stories, and it's unimaginable kind of hardships that they have been subjected to. And I think recently there was another report that people were being forced to drink a certain Chinese medicine, not just in other parts, but particularly in Xinjiang, old women, that their children are taken away. So you see, the amount of control it's not just surveillance, it's physical, it's mental, it's emotional, it's academic. Uyghur language has been almost done away with, and this is not just happening, by the way, in Xinjiang, it's also happening in Tibet and in Inner Mongolia now. So Chinese language is being imposed. It's a substantial amount of repression. So I think what China has achieved through force, we cannot imagine having that kind of that kind of imposing that kind of surveillance over India. So definitely the question of anything coming out of China and out of Xinjiang for that matter, it's almost out of question. So I think thanks essentially to the activists and especially the Western media agencies, at least some of them, they do some serious journalism. We all have almost half a dozen journalists in China for that matter. I mean, for this country of this size, having almost half dozen or even a dozen for that matter, if you count the camp of the supporter staff, maybe a dozen, but not more than that for sure. And so you see, we hardly have any presence in China. Most of them are based in Beijing and Shanghai, and they go to events mostly, which are invited and sponsored mostly by the Chinese. And if you go as a journalist visa, there is anyway much more restriction. So coming out of stories which come out of Xinjiang is very, very difficult. The Chinese social media, it's WeChat, which is strictly censored. In Xinjiang in particular, they have asked the locals to install a software which keeps track of which website they go to, what communication they do. If you go to those regions, I think especially if you happen to meet the minority people, and if they accompany you somewhere, for example, if you go as a tourist, maybe they accompany you, then they will be very, very reluctant to talk to you because, there are cameras watching, there are audios which are recording. So it's a very, very strict level of surveillance. You cannot even compare those things even to a situation in any other part of India for that matter. So because of this, and of course there is technology. You'll have to believe that technology has come to the rescue of the Communist Party of China. And it's not just capitalism. So they used money initially. So they said the Chinese people that, well, we give you prosperity, you let us continue to rule. And now they are saying, okay, fine, you just be there, we'll make sure that you listen to us. That's technology is doing its part. So it's mobile, and I think if you just imagine it's the world where technology controls everything. Your information with Google is much more than possibly your wife knows, or maybe your husband knows, or maybe your mother knows. They know what the hell you are doing at what point of time. And if it happens to be a state like China where privacy and data security, especially for the Chinese people, and even anybody who is in China for that matter, is almost forgiven. God help you if you are thinking about data security in China. Then it's all washed for that matter. Let's be frank about it. There's no denying that fact, and that happens with anybody who is inside China's borders. There is enough evidence to believe that, well, even Americans snooped on others, but at least they have courts, they have media, you can go and fight them, contest them maybe. You can criticize Trump, but in China, I think that's absolutely not a possibility. So you see, there is technology, there is military, there is security, there is propaganda, there is language, and that on top of that, a state is openly saying that, well, these are splitists, these are religious extremists, we need to target them, we need to change them. They have set up camps. So you see, what is left after that? I think, do I need to add more?
Thank you. The next question is to Sumit Chaturvedi. And this question is from Dr. Madhusmita Rao. While democracy is decaying and while most of the mainstream media is sort of paralyzed, not focusing on main issues and diverting people from the shortcomings of the government, do you think that the impact of social media is going to affect the action of the government?
Yeah, that's a very good question. As we have seen in the past few years, especially in the post-liberalization scenario, as much as advancements have happened in mainstream media, especially with the electronic media, technology coming in, setting up of different channels, electronic news channels in different parts of the country. At the same time, there has been this tendency of political and capital, and as the asker of the question has said, that it has almost come to fruition in the past few years. And the mainstream media has sort of paralyzed, it is towing a line. And so social media has been this constant ray of hope, as I said, even in the past decade or more than a decade's time, where it was, where if a particular section or even an individual, when they were being targeted by a certain story or by a certain narrative, they were able to use social media to give their own version and try to not just influence, but at least try to make a dent in the public opinion in their favor. Even a story is going on these days about a certain celebrity, and we all know how it is playing out. The entire mainstream media is hounding on this particular story, and social media is the only resort for that person to give their own version of the story, which otherwise would not be heard. And even if it is heard, so here comes the tricky point, that even when that certain person is trying to give their own version of the story, there is an entire ecosystem of of a certain group which is trying to discredit that version of the story. So while social media is an important I suppose it's the only medium which is a last resort for those people who are trying to give out their story against this huge behemoth of mainstream media. There is also this ecosystem which reflects the dominant interest. In this case, it could be about the dominant gender, and in other cases, sometimes about dominant religion or the dominant caste or dominant sexual identity even. So those groups are also very much active. So here, tricky point, it will always be a very fine balance, and finding the key would be to find solidarity for the vulnerable groups, to find solidarity among like-minded groups who may not be directly related to their particular cause, but the intersectional solidarity will be very important in countering the dominant narratives. So intersectional solidarity is very important, even in social media, to basically counteract, because that ecosystem is so strong, empowered by the mainstream discourse at the same time, that people who are on social media, who are trying to, if they are trying to counter that narrative, they will have to find intersectional solidarity. So if certain group is concerned about their particular issue, about their identity or some issue of their own, they will have to find cross-border, inter-group solidarity. That is, I suppose, the only way how social media perspective can be salvaged in the current scenario.
So the next question is again to Mr. Chaturvedi, and this question is from Anirban Chatterjee. In the light of democratization, why is it that social media in India has not been able to ignite a debate on the necessity of public health in the face of the vulnerabilities being faced by the migrant workers, while it has sparked a debate in leading capitalist countries in the West? How do you see this apparent dichotomy?
Yeah, this is a very good question. And, what I see is that it goes to say with the entire media framework, media infrastructure of the country. So when you look at narratives which go on social media, they are often, they have to be, now the point is that while narratives were being created for the past many years, in the recent years, they have also been identified for their penchant for being fake. Like, there can be many fake narratives, and people have come to realize that problem, especially in the current pandemic crisis. Even official government ministries also passed out many public notices about the dangers of fake narratives. And so basically, so the idea of fake narratives has been acknowledged in the past few years, and especially during this pandemic as well. Now, so therefore, what is required is a good corroboration of the story which is going on. Now, this corroboration comes from either official sources or it comes from mainstream media, which has a degree, even though the credibility of mainstream media has taken a big hit, there is still a degree of authority or a degree of credibility that they enjoy. And so the mainstream media sources are often quoted in those stories. Now, often they are misquoted as well. So that shows how much importance is given to mainstream news channels and mainstream news publications. And so sometimes they misquote it as well, but that only highlights how important that source is. So when it comes to mobilizing any debate on social media, Therefore, it needs to be people on social media, if they try to initiate debates or certain discourses on public health, even in case of like migrant workers, they try to bring out their opinions. But at the end of the day, if it's going on social media, if certain individuals or certain groups of people are also trying to mobilize these discourses, at the end of the day, people might dismiss them because it's just another person's opinion. So until and unless there is this mainstream information which keeps going, it needs to be flooded into social media so that the social media discourse gets influenced by it. In our case, what we have seen is that for a long time, when the migrant worker crisis also happened, again, there was this ecosystem which was either trying to counteract the stories which were given out by a few select news publications, or they were trying to bring out other stories in order to take the focus away from those stories. So a big problem is that of the mainstream media. At the same time, social media is sort of helped by online convergent journalism initiatives in these days, which are independent to a certain extent, who keep bringing out public interest stories, and they have tried to initiate public discourse, especially with migrant workers issue. They tried to bring that up, but it's a huge challenge to, especially in India, even though digital access has this to a certain degree, but we are still not using digital sources so much for information and public discourse. It's mostly about, even if it has filtered to rural areas, we know how TikTok has become a sensation even in rural areas. It became until it was banned, but still public discourse has not reached through digital media to so many places. So there are a lot of challenges because of which public discourse around such issues was not able to materialize as it happened in Western countries, where firstly, the digital access is far more. There is also, it's not just quantitative, it's also qualitative, where public discourse reaches to a larger audiences. And also the mainstream media there is, for instance, in US, even if mainstream media is controlled by a few select groups which control the entire cross-media ownership, they still have a degree of public issues being in the center of their news stories, which they call. That trend has declined in India. So there are a lot of challenges because of which in India this kind of discourse could not materialize. Whatever degree, in little degree it could, but not in a big way.
Thank you, Mr. Chaturvedi. With this, I formally would like to close the question and answer session. And I would like to take this opportunity again to thank both the speakers to share their thoughts and ideas, opinions on the theme of today's webinar, which is Rethinking Information Flow, social media in times of COVID-19. So thank you to you again, to both of you. I would now request my colleague, Professor Dr. Mohammad Nasiruddin Mondol, the head of the Department of Arabic and also a committee member of the department, to propose the formal vote of thanks. Nasir.
Hello.
Yes, you are audible, Nasir.
Hello, everyone. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Yes. Respected Principal Sir, the keynote speakers and dear participants, I am Dr. Mohammad Nasiruddin Mondol, here to present the vote of thanks to the people who made this event successful. It's my privilege to have been asked to propose a vote of thanks for today's national webinar on COVID-19. First of all, on behalf of the BA program, Bamanpukur Humayun Kabir Mahavidyalay, I would like to thank both the keynote speakers of the event, Dr. Tilak Jha and Mr. Sumit Chaturvedi, for sharing their views, concerns with the respect to the topic of the webinar and providing us valuable insights on the role of social media in this ongoing pandemic. A big thanks to our chief patron, our principal sir, Dr. Subhash Vishwas, for making this event possible with his support and encouragement. My sincere thanks to Ms. Meenakshi Biswas, Convener BA Program and Assistant Professor, Department of Political Science, Bamanpukur Humayun Kabir Mahavidyalaya, for her efforts in arrangement and conducting the webinar. I would like to express my sincere thanks to Dr. Runa Das Choudhury, Assistant Professor, Department of Sociology, Bamanpukur Humayun Kabir Mahavidyalaya, for carrying out the proceedings of the webinar, and Ms. Paromita Mondol, Assistant Professor, Department of Philosophy, Bamanpukur Humayun Kabir Mahavidyalaya, for her effort post the event in the process of certification. A special thanks to Mr. Dibyendu Sardar for providing technical assistance. I must not forget to thank all the members of the Seminar and Research Forum, Bamanpukur Humayun Kabir Mahavidyalaya, and my all colleagues for inviting us. This event would not have been successful without the participants. Thank you all the participants for blessing us with your presence. Thank you all. Now over to Professor Meenakshi Biswas.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Tilak and Sumit, for agreeing to be with us today. And you have shared your valuable insights on the relevant issues that have been discussed today. And I think all participants have also might gathered a lot of information from today's session. Thank you once again. I would like to end the session here.